I thank you all for showing up this morning. In my experience, when the cat is sort of away, at least from the pulpit, people say, you know what, we haven't seen Aunt Mary in the longest time. And, but that's all right. I appreciate you being here. This is a very important day in the life of the faith community because it is one of those days where we begin to see Jesus and find out who this babe from Bethlehem really is. That's why it's called an epiphany. It is, after all, a time where we now see Jesus and begin to find out a whole lot more. Sam will begin to lead us through all the way into the Lenten season, and we'll find out more about who Jesus is and how he expects us to live. And so today we come to that initial symbol, which is baptism. It is very important, and I'm going to zero in on one aspect of that. And if you have other questions about baptism that I cannot answer, you can ask me in the parlor, and then I'll ask Sam for the correct answers. Matthew chapter 3, beginning in verse number 17. Now we've already, if you've read prior to chapter 3, we've come to a little bit of understanding of who John the Baptist is. And then the word then happens in chapter 3, verse 13. Listen to this. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at Jordan to be baptized by him. Now John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, let it be so for now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. And then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Ladies and gentlemen, the word of the Lord given to us on this very day. I need to begin by offering to you a confession. Now that I am old and decrepit, my memory is just flat out not what it used to be. I mean, it's just not. I went into the doctor's office not long ago for my annual checkup, and the doctor always asks you this question. I cannot believe that they actually ask you to pay after they give you this advice. But I went in, and the doctor said, Rick, how do you think you're feeling? And I said, well, I said, Doc, I really am getting kind of old and decrepit. And he looked at me and he said, well, Rick, I'll give you one of two of those things. But he didn't tell me which one. John and Mary were having the same kind of difficulties. So they decided that they too needed to go to the doctor's office to get a checkup, to make absolutely sure that nothing physically was wrong with them. The checkup was good. Everything was normal. But the doctor finally suggested that, if you are forgetting things, it would be probably a good idea for you to write things down. Just write things down, and that way you will remember the things you want to remember. So they went home from the doctor's office, paid him, of course, for that sage advice. And later that night, as the couple were at home watching a rerun of Downton Abbey, John got up from his chair and went toward the kitchen. And his wife said, John, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to the kitchen, dear. Well, she said, while you're there, why don't you get me some ice cream? And do you think you can remember it between here and the kitchen? Maybe you ought to write it down like the doctor said. And he said, I think I can remember to get you some ice cream, dear. And she said, but can you remember to put strawberries on the top if you don't write it down? It made him pretty irritated, And he didn't answer her, and so he just went storming right off into the kitchen. About 20 minutes later, though, he comes back, and he hands her a plate of bacon and eggs. And she starts at the plate of bacon and eggs for a moment, and then she says, in a most angry tone, and I told you so kind of tone, we husbands know that tone, do we not? And she said to him, now, John, I told you, didn't I, that you had to write things down or you would forget it. So where's my toast? Remembering things is a precious gift. And as we consider this morning baptism on a Sunday in the Epiphany, I want us to center on remembering. And in pondering the meaning of baptism, I also have to confess to you that I have at least 2 peeves. Now, my wife is sick this morning, so she's not here, so you cannot ask her. But I have at least 2 peeves that really get me. The first one is when a family comes up to me and says, Brother Preacher, I would like to have my child christened. Oh! Now, I wasn't always diplomatic, and I hope that you are not offended if you have asked Sam that very same kind of question. But my response is this mantra. Ships are christened, buildings are dedicated, but people are baptized. Now, the second peeve comes when I had a conversation with one of my colleagues, of all things, and we were talking about baptism. And he said to me, and I'm telling you the truth, he said to me, Rick, you know what? I never do the Methodist baptismal ritual in the service on page 52, if you're interested. I never do that baptismal ritual because the ritual says, remember your baptism and be thankful. I don't do it because it is impossible for you to remember it if you were baptized as a child. I mean, how can you remember your baptism, he said, if you were baptized as a 3-month-old? You were only told about it. So he said, I'm telling you, I don't care what the bishop says, I'm not going to do it. He has a prominent church, by the way. Now, that seems logical to me on the face of it. But I remind you that the church deliberately and consciously uses that word in the ritual, remember. Now, I don't want to be too critical, but if that pastor had read the preceding paragraphs of the ritual baptism number 4, he would have seen that the baptism, the word remember, is used in at least 2 ways. First, the word is used in the sense of calling to mind an event that we've experienced somewhere along the line. It's kind of like, hey, do you remember the tornado of 2013? You remember that? Or do you remember how Moses led the people of Israel across the sea of reeds? But secondly, it can also mean a sense of waking up, of calling to mind something that is true, a truth. It's something like, now, do you remember what to do in case of a fire? Or, Sam, do you remember that preaching and public speaking is a gift that you have? You got to be nice to the boss. Now, that's what I suggested to my preacher friend. And I think that's what the church means when it asks us to remember our baptism and then to be thankful. Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, said that there should be no greater comfort for a Christian in times of difficulty, in times of your testing, than to remember that you are that you are baptized. And he said, when I am in crisis or difficulty, I always point to my head and say, I am baptized. He said it in Latin, and I won't say it in Latin because I would not do it well. Why, do you ask? Well, I'm so glad you asked that. It's because baptism is a sign that the Christian life is not, listen to this, folks, Christian life is not dependent upon you and what you do, but it is rather dependent upon what God has already done for you in Jesus Christ. Methodist, prevenient grace. Now, cleverly, of course, this brings us back to the scripture lesson for the morning, where you will note the story of Jesus' baptism, and suddenly he shows up on the banks of the Jordan River, and folks, he is a passive recipient of baptism. Now, you biblical scholars will know that this is the very first time that we've seen Jesus in action. But really, he's not in action at all. He's not preaching. He's not healing. But he is receiving. And John the Baptist, who seems to know who Jesus really is fairly troubled that Jesus would come to him for baptism. I mean, is this any way for a Messiah to act? Coming out here in the desert to be baptized by some weird preacher, some wild desert preacher? But Jesus says he does this to fulfill all righteousness. Now, what on earth does he mean by that? He means, folks, that in order for us to be righteous, we must submit totally to the will of God. To align ourselves with God's intentions. And to remember means that we remember that in our baptism. Folks, do you realize that your baptism was a public sign? And do you also realize that United Methodist rarely, except for, it has to be exceptional, we never do private baptisms. We do it publicly. It's a public sign, just as Jesus's was a public sign. It's a public sign of an intention to submit our lives to God's desires and God's intention for our life. So remember that the life you live is not your own. Your life has been commandeered by the God who gave you life in the first place, has given you a vocation, a sense of direction, a part to play in the panoramic view and the work of God in the world. Now, I like weddings, sort of, except working with the mother of the bride. I'm sorry. But weddings are such a neat event because the bride and groom asks their family and their friends to be a part of their vows. And as I sit there and sometimes as I preside, I'm asked to remember my vows as they take them. It's something we do together, not just the bride and groom, but I remember my vows, my responsibilities, what I'm supposed to do. We have promised, even in our baptism, or it's been promised on our behalf, to submit to the righteousness of God in our lives. Karl Barth, the great theologian, said it this way: remember your baptism and be thankful. And this is one of the reasons that the church has weekly worship services. Because, folks, it is so easy. I don't know about you, but it's so easy to forget what really matters. I mean, I get tied up in stuff out in the world, and I sometimes forget who I am and who God has created me to be. Do you have that problem, anybody? Am I just the Lone Ranger on this? To forget and to lose sight of who we really are and meant to be. Now, folks, we all know what a gifted preacher Sam is. I mean, don't we? We all know what a gifted preacher he is. But do you know why it is that he has that baptismal font there in the back? Have you ever thought about that? Think about it. Have you ever thought about it? When you turn around and leave this worship center this morning and you follow the acolyte who's taking the light of Christ out into the world, you almost run smack dab into that font. And you can't shake Sam's hand because it's in the way. But it's there to remind you that when you leave this sanctuary, you are a baptized person in Christ. You do know what Christian means, don't you, in the early church? It meant that you were a little Christ. So when you pass that baptismal font, you are to be reminded that you are a little Christ in the world and that you have received the sign and the symbol of Christ's baptism. And when we come into the sanctuary, likewise, we pass that baptismal font, don't we? And we are to remember, as we are here as chosen people of God who receives the sign of God's acceptance of us. Now, remembering has always been a pretty important part of my life. That's something I really think is very important. It bothers me a lot that we forget people, even in the life of our sanctuary, our own community, that have done so much for our own church. But those things were important. So I kind of made a little ritual out of that when I baptized children. I would sit down just before the service and then just after the service, and I would write those children a letter. I tell them what happened on that day as they were baptized. I said who was there, what was going on, and how it was that some dumb old coot that they'll never remember took them in his arms and took them around the sanctuary to introduce them to their faith community. And the choir always sang an anthem, a baptismal anthem, while I was doing that with their name in it. And it was a special day. That letter was to be opened at their time of confirmation when they were older. It was a time that I wanted them to remember the importance of the sign and the symbol of God's grace as they had it in the midst of the community. And I wanted them to remember more than that, how as an infant, not having to do anything at all, God had received them through baptism. And now as they came to confirmation, they would accept their acceptance from God. And I would remind them that their baptism was something that God did to them, not something that they did for themselves. For folks, baptism is a sign, as a gift that God has given something to them. It has been bestowed to them, and they received it without merit. It was a gift. That's why we do infant baptism. Yes, that's why we do that. And that should remind us all of how we stand with God throughout all of our lives. We receive God as a passive. First, passively. God comes to us, has always come to us. Prevenient grace. Now, I'm probably going to step on some toes, but now that I'm out of the conference, I can probably do this. I'm of the opinion that the more we market ourselves and manage our churches like big businesses, the less people believe, and the less we look like Jesus, and the less it must seem that we are relying on Jesus. Maybe that's why the church in our country is not growing very much, but churches in places like Russia and Africa and China are growing like crazy, where marketing and management and professional isms are oftentimes illegal things. When I was in active ministry, I was inundated with literature and conferences on how to build a successful church or how to execute the latest plan. But folks, discipleship is not a plan or program. It's a life that rubs off on another life. Duh! It's a seasoning, it's a flavoring, it's a permeating that life, like salt. And I would suggest that those who remember their baptism are called in thankfulness to be a little Christ every day to their neighbor. And that, folks, simply speaking, is what a missional church looks like. It's a church full of people who remembers their baptism and shares God's love with the gifts and graces that God has given you with your neighbor. I have a favorite daughter, my only one. Her name is Jennifer. Jennifer has just completed her MBA in finance, and she is a COO of a company called Results in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She flies back and forth to Dallas. They have a home there, so sometimes they go back and forth. But she was going to wow me the other day with some of the knowledge and wisdom that she has, and she is pretty smart thanks to her mother. She has some of the clients like AT&T and DirecTV, and some of these big corporations are part of her clientele. But she said, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to tell you, I have found a new marketing method that's out that is incredibly successful." And she calls it this, and get this, and if you want this, I'll let you know later. It's called Alternative Channel Sales Strategy. Now, that's a fancy title, but the methodology is really very simple. She said what we do is that we train salespeople in targeted areas to go out and to sell the product face-to-face rather than doing telemarketing or on the computer. And she said, "You can't believe how well this works and how much money we are making in our corporation." Now, I listened like a good dad supposed to listen. And then I said to her, "Jen, you grew up in the church. You grew up in the parsonage. Don't you think that sounds a little biblical to you?" That's just how the church grew, with baptized Christians who remembered their baptism and in thankfulness for God's grace, shared it with someone else, face to face. Methodist, sanctifying grace. Or as Karl Barth once said again, anybody who stops on the sidewalk and points upward will draw a crowd of onlookers, each one looking to see what the other one is looking at. So, folks, if there's to be marketing done within the church and to become a missional church, that's how you do it. Pointing upward to something that has changed our lives. Now, I hope this has not been an overstatement to say that when the church baptizes an infant or a young child, the faith community, us, is reminding itself that no matter what the age of the recipient of baptism, we never grow out of our complete dependence upon God. That's what we're going to be doing in a few moments in our baptismal renewal. You realize that we never baptized people except one time. You do know that. That's why we do the renewal service. We never become so adult, so adept at the faith that we don't have to every day reach out in faith to God's grace and to remind ourselves of the gift of life that He's given to us, and to share that truth with everyone. So this morning, when you renew your baptismal vows, or when you almost run over the font leaving the church this morning, the acolyte takes the light of Christ into the world, and we follow afterward, remember this: the Christian life is a lifelong training of submitting ourselves to God. It's allowing your life, folks, to be out of your control, and learning to live as a dependent creature in a culture that keeps telling us that we are independent creators and that we can do our own thing. In other words, my new Piedmont friends, this morning when you come for renewal and you pass that baptismal font later, let it be a reminder of your baptism. Remember your baptism and be thankful. Bow with me in prayer. Our gracious God, we give you thanks that in Jesus Christ, you called each of us to be part of your family, to witness to your work in our world,